James had always known Lisa had a sharp tongue, but he never expected her to use it as a weapon against him in the worst way possible. One evening, as their divorce proceedings dragged on, Lisa smirked at him over the dining table, the same table where they had once shared countless family dinners. Her tone was laced with venom as she leaned in and whispered, "By the time this is over, James, I'll have the house, the kids, and half your salary. You'll be left with nothing." She thought she had won. But Lisa had underestimated him. The day of the final hearing arrived and Lisa strutted into court, expecting to walk out victorious. But, as James' lawyer calmly laid out the evidence, her affair, her reckless spending, her threats to falsely accuse him of abuse, the color drained from her face. Then, the final blow. The judge ruled in James' favor. She wouldn't be getting the house, she wouldn't be getting alimony, she wouldn't even get primary custody of the kids. Lisa gasped, her confident smirk shattering into pure panic. "This isn't fair," she screeched, her voice echoing through the courtroom. But James just stood tall, watching as karma delivered the justice she never saw coming. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. James had always believed in the strength of his marriage. For 15 years, he and Lisa had built a life together, raising their 2 children, Michael, now 14, and Sophia, 10, in their comfortable Texas home. On the surface, their life appeared stable, predictable even. He had a steady career as an engineer, and Lisa worked as a finance manager, balancing their household finances with precision. They had their routines, their shared responsibilities, and the occasional disagreements like any married couple. But lately, something had shifted. At first, James dismissed it as a phase, assuming Lisa was just stressed from work or overwhelmed with daily responsibilities. But the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Lisa had grown distant, emotionally detached in a way that went beyond the usual ups and downs of a long marriage. She no longer lingered at the breakfast table, engaging in casual conversation, and instead seemed in a constant rush to leave the house. When she returned home from work, she was either distracted or irritable, offering vague responses to his questions. The laughter they once shared had faded into silence, replaced by empty exchanges and quick dismissals. James couldn't remember the last time they had spent an evening together, just the 2 of them. Whenever he tried to suggest a movie night or dinner out, she either claimed exhaustion or brushed him off, always finding an excuse to avoid any meaningful connection. He wanted to believe it was temporary, that she was just going through a rough patch, but deep down, an unease had settled in his gut. There were too many inconsistencies. Lisa's late nights at work were becoming more frequent, yet when he casually asked about her workload, she would snap at him, as if he were interrogating her. She had started dressing differently, paying more attention to her appearance, wearing outfits that felt out of place for her usual routine. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter or living room table, was now always in her hand or tucked away where he couldn't see the screen. And then there was the matter of her wedding ring. Or rather, the sudden absence of it. When he asked, she had laughed it off, claiming it had become too tight and uncomfortable, but James knew better. He told himself not to jump to conclusions, that every marriage had its phases, that people changed and evolved. Maybe she just needed space. Maybe she was struggling with something she wasn't ready to talk about. But as the weeks passed and the distance between them grew, the unsettling feeling in his chest only tightened. He wanted to believe they could find their way back to each other, but for the first time in his marriage, he felt like a stranger in his own home. And worse, he feared that Lisa had already made up her mind to leave long before he ever had a chance to fight for what they had built. James tried to shake off the unease creeping into his thoughts, but every little change in Lisa's behavior chipped away at the illusion that everything was fine. The late nights became routine, each excuse flimsier than the last. At first, she would mention work meetings or urgent deadlines, but when James asked any follow-up questions, she would get defensive, irritated even, as if his curiosity was an inconvenience. "God, James, do you want me to quit my job just so I can be home at 5 every day?" she snapped one evening when he casually asked if she'd be home for dinner. It wasn't the words that got to him, it was the way she said them, as if his concern was ridiculous, as if expecting her to be present in their marriage was somehow unreasonable. Then there was the phone. It was always within her reach, never left unattended, always positioned screen down when she placed it on the table. She used to be absent-minded about it, often leaving it on the nightstand or couch, but now she clutched it like a lifeline. Sometimes, James would catch her smiling at the screen, letting out quiet chuckles, laughter he hadn't heard from her in months. He would ask what was so funny, but she would just shake her head and mutter something about a stupid meme, never offering to show him. He wanted to trust her. He told himself he was being paranoid, but trust had to be reinforced by honesty, and Lisa wasn't giving him any. One night, when she was in the shower, he noticed her phone vibrating on the dresser. The name on the screen was just an initial, nothing more. The screen dimmed before he could get a better look, and when she stepped out of the bathroom moments later, she snatched the phone up instantly, as if she had sensed him looking. James hadn't even touched it, but her reaction was all the confirmation he needed. She stopped wearing her wedding ring around the same time. At first, he thought maybe she had forgotten it. Everyone forgets things sometimes. But then he noticed she never wore it anymore. When he brought it up, she didn't even hesitate before lying to his face. "It's too tight," she said, waving her hand dismissively. James frowned. "Too tight?" He glanced at her fingers, which looked no different than they had for years. "Since when?" she sighed, exasperated. "I don't know, James. It just started bothering me. Do you want me to cut off my circulation just to wear a ring?" The irritation in her voice was enough to shut down any further discussion, but James couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. That ring had never been too tight before. As if the late nights and secrecy weren't enough, Lisa started changing in other ways too. She began dressing differently, putting more effort into her appearance in ways she never had before. She used to be practical about fashion, chic but comfortable, never one to waste time on unnecessary embellishments. But now, she was wearing tighter clothes, higher heels, more makeup. She had started going to the gym regularly despite never showing any interest in fitness before. James wanted to be supportive. Maybe she just wanted to feel good about herself. But something about it felt calculated, deliberate. It wasn't about personal growth. It was about transformation, one that had nothing to do with him. The most painful part was the way she had completely withdrawn from him physically. It wasn't just about sex. It was the absence of all intimacy. The small touches, the lingering kisses, the playful affection, they had all faded into nothing. At night, she lay beside him in bed like a stranger, her body turned away, creating a distance that felt impossible to bridge. He tried to be patient, tried to initiate conversations, but every attempt was met with the same detached indifference. "I'm just tired," she would say, always tired. Too tired to talk, too tired to laugh, too tired to touch him, but never too tired to be glued to her phone at all hours of the night. Michael noticed too, one evening as they sat at the dinner table, just the two of them. His son poked at his food and asked, "Dad, why doesn't Mom eat dinner with us anymore?" James felt his heart clench at the question. He forced a smile, unwilling to burden his son with the truth. "She's been busy with work, buddy," he said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Michael frowned, clearly not convinced, but he didn't push the subject. James hated that his children were noticing, hated that he had no real answer for them. He wanted to believe it was just a phase, that maybe she was struggling with something she wasn't ready to talk about, that if he gave her time, she would come back to him. But deep down, he knew better. He had known for weeks now, maybe even months, but he had been too afraid to admit it. Lisa wasn't just distracted. She wasn't just tired. She was pulling away from him, from their marriage, from their family. And the worst part was, she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. James pulled into the driveway, exhausted from a long day at work. The house was dark except for a faint glow upstairs. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kids were at a friend's house for a sleepover, which meant it was just him and Lisa tonight. Maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to reconnect. He missed her, missed the way she used to greet him at the door, missed the laughter they used to share, missed the warmth that had vanished from their marriage. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, hoping that tonight would be different. As he climbed the stairs, he noticed their bedroom door slightly ajar, the soft hum of music drifting from inside. His heart quickened. Lisa never listened to music while getting ready, not since their early years of dating. He pushed the door open fully and stopped cold. Lisa stood in front of the mirror, applying deep red lipstick with slow, deliberate precision. She wore a dress he had never seen before, tight, revealing, the kind of dress designed to turn heads. A pair of high heels sat beside her, the tallest she had ever owned. Her perfume, one he didn't recognize, filled the air. A scent too intoxicating, too alluring for an ordinary night. For a split second, James let himself believe this was for him. Maybe she had planned a surprise dinner, a night out together to fix whatever had broken between them. He clung to that hope, desperate to believe in it, even as something in the air felt irreversibly wrong. "Are we going somewhere?" he asked, his voice tentative, hopeful. Lisa met his gaze in the mirror. Her expression didn't soften. She didn't smile. Instead, she sighed, as if annoyed by the question, as if he were an inconvenience. Then, with a smirk so cold it made his stomach twist, she said, "I have a date." The words sliced through him like a blade. For a moment he thought he had misheard her, that maybe she was joking, playing some cruel game, but the look in her eyes told him everything. His stomach dropped, his heart pounded, his hands trembled at his sides. The world around him blurred, muffled, as if he had been thrown under water. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Lisa turned back to the mirror, continuing to apply her makeup with the same casual ease as if she had just informed him she was going out with friends. James finally found his voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. "A date?" Lisa didn't even flinch. "You're not even hiding it anymore?" She let out a cruel, humorless laugh and finally turned to face him. "Why should I? You stopped being my husband a long time ago." His breath caught in his throat. His wife, the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, was standing in front of him, openly admitting to her betrayal without a shred of remorse. Not only that, but she was taunting him, daring him to react. James felt a storm of emotions threaten to consume him. Anger, heartbreak, humiliation, but he forced himself to stay in control. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, to make her understand the destruction she had just unleashed. But he saw it now, clearer than ever. She didn't care. Lisa wasn't here to apologize. She wasn't here to fix their marriage. She had already made her choice long before this moment. For months, he had told himself that maybe she was just distant, that she was going through something she wasn't ready to talk about, that if he just held on a little longer, things would get better. But he had been lying to himself. Lisa hadn't been pulling away, she had been running, and tonight she was making sure he knew she had no intention of ever coming back. Something inside him shifted. The sadness, the desperation, the need to understand. All of it turned to cold, calculated clarity. This wasn't about saving their marriage anymore. It was about saving himself. Lisa watched him, waiting for a reaction, expecting him to yell, to beg, to fall apart. But James did none of those things. Instead, he took a deep breath and straightened his posture. "If you want to leave," he said evenly, his voice steady, "do it. But not under my roof." Lisa blinked, caught off guard by his composure. Then her smirk returned. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, crossing her arms. "I like this house. And when we divorce, I'll make sure I get it." James clenched his jaw. "And if you try to fight me on that," she continued, "I'll call the cops and tell them you threatened me, maybe even hit me. You know how it works. They'll arrest you first and ask questions later. 48 hours in a holding cell, and by the time you're out, I'll have changed the locks." A cold, seething rage settled deep in his bones. This wasn't just about cheating. This wasn't just betrayal. Lisa wasn't just leaving him. She was trying to destroy him. James felt the familiar heat of anger surge through his veins, but he refused to let it control him. He had spent months walking on eggshells, second-guessing himself, trying to salvage something that had already been reduced to ashes. Lisa wanted a reaction. She wanted him to explode, to scream, to break. She wanted to paint him as the bitter, unstable husband who couldn't handle reality. But James wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, he took a deep breath, forcing every muscle in his body to relax. "If you want to leave, do it," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "But not under my roof." Lisa scoffed, rolling her eyes like he was some naive fool clinging to the illusion of control. "I already told you," she said, tilting her chin up defiantly. "I'm not going anywhere. I like this house, and after the divorce, it's going to be mine." James held her gaze, unblinking. "We'll see about that." She smirked. "I've already talked to a lawyer. With the right argument, I'll walk away with more than just the house. So don't make this harder on yourself, James." She turned back to the mirror, applying the final touches to her makeup, adjusting the thin strap of her dress as if he were no longer in the room. It was the ultimate insult. She had dismissed him entirely. She had moved on before the marriage was even over. But she had underestimated him. James wasn't going to fight her with words. He wasn't going to argue or plead. He wasn't going to let her dictate how this ended. No, he was going to do what he did best. He was going to think, plan, and execute. She thought she had won. She had no idea the game had only just begun. As Lisa picked up her purse and strutted toward the door, he merely stepped aside, allowing her to pass. He didn't stop her, didn't say a word, just watched as she left their bedroom with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. He listened as her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, each step oozing arrogance. She thought she was in control. James let her believe it. He waited until she disappeared downstairs before moving. His mind was already calculating, breaking down the situation into a problem that needed solving. If Lisa was determined to betray him in the most humiliating way possible, then he was going to make sure she felt the consequences. Not through anger, not through violence, but through something much more effective. Denying her exactly what she wanted. He walked into the garage, his eyes landing on her car. It was parked in the driveway just as it always was, pristine and waiting for her grand escape. Without hesitation, James popped the hood and quickly disconnected the battery. A simple trick, one she wouldn't notice until she was already inside, turning the key in growing frustration. Step 1 was complete. Next, he went back inside and found her purse on the kitchen counter. He pulled out her phone, smoothly removing the battery before placing it back in its original spot. No frantic texts, no calls, no begging her mystery date to come to the rescue. Step 2, done. For the final move, James locked the garage door from the inside and pocketed the key. No chance in hell was she taking his truck. As he finished setting everything into place, he leaned against the counter, taking in the moment. He wasn't just delaying her night. He was making a statement. She had been the one to break their marriage, to throw away everything they had built. But she wasn't going to dictate how this ended. Lisa came downstairs minutes later, fully dressed, looking every bit the woman who had already discarded her past life. She barely spared him a glance as she grabbed her purse. "Out of my way," she muttered, heading straight for the door. James didn't move. He simply took a slow sip of his coffee and watched. Lisa swung open the door, stepping out into the night. A moment later, she was at her car, her heels clicking against the pavement. Then, silence. A beat passed. Then another. The sound of a key turning, then turning again. Then the unmistakable sound of frustration. Sharp, growing, frantic. James smirked. Seconds later, Lisa stormed back inside, her face twisted in fury. "What the hell did you do to my car?" she demanded. He raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "What are you talking about?" She threw her hands in the air. "It won't start. It was fine this morning. What did you do?" James took another sip of his coffee. "Maybe it's just bad luck." Lisa's eyes narrowed, her hands clenching into fists. "I'll just call." She yanked her phone out of her purse, pressing the power button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, harder this time. Her breath hitched. James didn't need to say a word. He watched as realization dawned on her face, the slow unraveling of confidence as the pieces fell into place. Her car wouldn't start. Her phone was useless. She had nowhere to go. Lisa turned on him, voice sharp. "You think this is funny? You think you're going to stop me from leaving?" James shrugged. "You can leave anytime you want." Her eyes burned with rage. "You know exactly what I mean." James set his coffee cup down with deliberate ease, locking eyes with her. "Then you should have planned better." Lisa's face flushed with fury, but she refused to let herself lose control. "Fine," she spat. "I'll just take your truck." James smirked, leaning against the counter. "Be my guest." She stormed off toward the garage, her movements sharp and angry. A moment later, there was a pause, then a string of curses, then the unmistakable sound of fists pounding against a locked door. James exhaled slowly, savoring the moment. Lisa thought she was untouchable. Tonight, she was learning otherwise. Lisa pounded her fist against the locked garage door, her breathing sharp and erratic. James could hear her muttering to herself, her frustration bubbling over into something far more desperate. He remained where he was, sipping his coffee, calm, collected, watching the inevitable unfold. He had seen this side of Lisa before. When things didn't go her way, she didn't stop and think, she acted. A sudden, eerie silence filled the house. Then, the faint sound of a drawer opening, rummaging. James knew exactly what she was doing. The garage had an emergency override switch, but she had never paid attention to anything mechanical in the house before. The thought of her fumbling through tools, her perfect nails scratching against metal, trying to brute force her way through something she didn't understand, almost made him laugh. Then, the sound of glass shattering. James tensed, setting his cup down. Lisa had just broken into his truck. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. He could already predict what was coming next, every move she would make. She was still convinced she could win, that she could control the outcome. The roar of the truck's engine shattered the silence. James stepped toward the window just in time to see the tail lights flare red, the brake lights flashing as Lisa shifted into drive. She thought she had outmaneuvered him, thought she had found a way to leave. But what she didn't realize was that the garage door opener had been completely disconnected. The moment she hit the gas, James felt it before he saw it. The sickening crunch of metal against wood echoed through the house as the truck rammed straight into the closed garage door. The entire frame shook violently, the sound of tearing steel, splintering wood, and shrieking tires, creating a deafening explosion of chaos. The garage door didn't give way at first, but Lisa didn't stop. She jammed the gas pedal, determined to push through. The garage buckled under the pressure, hinges snapping, bolts giving way, and then, with one final horrific screech, the entire structure collapsed outward, leaving Lisa and the truck crashing through the wreckage. But that wasn't the worst part. James' gaze flicked beyond the debris just in time to see something that made his blood run cold. A police cruiser, parked directly in front of their driveway. For a split second, time seemed to slow. The officer in the driver's seat had just reached for his radio when the truck, still accelerating, barreled forward, slamming directly into the front of the police car. The force of the impact was immediate and violent, crumpling the cruiser's hood, sending the entire vehicle lurching backward a few feet. The passenger side door swung open from the force, and the officer on the right side who had just stepped out was knocked off balance, hitting the pavement hard. James barely had time to process what he was seeing before chaos erupted. The second officer, a woman with sharp red hair and a no-nonsense stance, reacted instantly, her gun already drawn as she lunged toward the driver's side of the truck. "Get out of the vehicle! Hands where I can see them!" For a moment, Lisa sat frozen behind the wheel, the realization of what she had just done crashing down on her like a tidal wave. The hood of the truck was steaming, the metal folded in like an accordion against the ruined police cruiser. Then, suddenly, she moved, not to get out, not to comply. She reached for her purse. The red-haired officer wasn't taking chances. She yanked the door open, grabbing Lisa by the arm and dragging her out before she could utter a single word. Lisa screamed in protest, thrashing wildly. "Get your hands off me! This isn't my fault! He did this! Her words were cut off as the officer shoved her against the truck, slapping handcuffs around her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer said, her voice sharp, unwavering. "I strongly suggest you use it." Neighbors had started to gather, stepping out onto their porches, some whispering, some openly gawking at the spectacle. James remained where he was, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. Lisa, once so smug, so sure of herself, was now a disheveled mess, her expensive dress covered in dust and streaks of oil, her perfectly styled hair in disarray. She turned her gaze toward him, eyes wild with fury. "James, do something!" He tilted his head slightly. "Like what?" Her face twisted in rage. "Tell them it was an accident. Tell them you locked me out." James let out a breath, shaking his head. "You made your choice, Lisa. Now live with it." The red-hand officer glanced between them, piecing things together in an instant. She didn't say anything, just tightened the cuffs and shoved Lisa toward the police car. Lisa struggled the entire way, screaming about how this wasn't fair, how it was all a setup, how she was the victim, but no one was listening. As the officers secured her in the back of the squad car, James turned and walked back inside, stepping over the wreckage of the garage door. Lisa had spent months treating him like he was nothing, like he was weak, like she could walk all over him. Tonight, she had finally learned just how wrong she was. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the houses lining the street, casting eerie shadows as neighbors stood on their porches, whispering among themselves. Some clutched their robes tightly, arms crossed, while others shamelessly pulled out their phones, recording every second of Lisa's meltdown. She was still thrashing in the back of the police car, her face twisted in rage and desperation, screaming through the cracked window. "This is bullshit. James, you bastard, tell them the truth. You did this. You set me up." James stood a few feet away, arms relaxed at his sides, his face unreadable. He wasn't going to give her the reaction she craved. He had spent too long being manipulated, being talked down to, being made to feel like he was losing his mind. But now, as he watched her screaming like a caged animal, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The red-haired officer who had cuffed Lisa approached him, her expression unreadable. "You, James Dawson?" He nodded. She glanced toward the wreckage of the garage, the police cruiser with its crushed hood, and the debris littering the driveway before turning back to him. "Mind explaining what the hell just happened?" James ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Where do you want me to start?" "Let's start with why your wife just rammed a truck into a police vehicle." James smirked slightly but quickly wiped it away. "That part's simple. She was in a hurry to get to her date." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Her date?" James nodded toward Lisa, who was still ranting incoherently from the back seat of the squad car. "Yeah, she told me, straight to my face, that she was going out with another man tonight. Packed herself up, dressed to the nines, and was about to walk out the door like it was the most normal thing in the world." The officer's jaw tightened. "And she tried to take your truck?" Her car mysteriously wouldn't start," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "She figured she could just take mine. Problem was, I had locked the garage. Guess she didn't think that part through." The officer scribbled something in her notepad, glancing up at him. "And did you intentionally disable her car?" James shrugged. "I might have, but that's not illegal, is it? It's my property. I never told her she couldn't call a cab." A ghost of a smirk played on the officer's lips before she quickly masked it with professionalism. "You're right, it's not illegal." She flipped the notepad shut. "We'll still need to file a report, given that she caused property damage and injured an officer. She's looking at some serious charges." James nodded, glancing over at Lisa. She was slumped against the seat now, tears streaking her perfectly done makeup, her dress wrinkled and stained from her reckless escape attempt. It was a far cry from the confident, untouchable woman who had stood in front of the mirror just an hour ago, applying lipstick with smug indifference. James knew this wasn't just about tonight. It was months, maybe even years of her believing she was smarter, stronger, more powerful than him. She had spent their entire marriage pushing boundaries, seeing how much she could get away with. And tonight, she had found her limit. Lisa's eyes locked onto his, fury burning behind them, but beneath it there was something else: fear. For the first time, she realized that she wasn't in control. James didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't say a word. He simply turned his back and walked inside, leaving her to sit in the back of that squad car, alone with the weight of her choices. Lisa sat stiffly in the courtroom, her jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. The pristine white blouse she wore was crisp, ironed to perfection, but it couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes, the subtle tremble in her hands. She wasn't the same woman who had confidently told James she was taking everything from him. That version of her had shattered the night she crashed through the garage door, her delusions of control crushed as thoroughly as the police cruiser she had rammed into. James sat across from her, calm, composed, as his lawyer laid out the facts with the kind of efficiency that came with knowing you had already won. The charges against Lisa were extensive: reckless endangerment, destruction of property, assaulting a police officer with a vehicle. The prosecutor had wasted no time ensuring she faced the full consequences of her actions. But it wasn't just the criminal case that was destroying her. It was the divorce proceedings. Lisa had tried to fight. She had walked into mediation with that same arrogant smirk, believing she could spin the story, paint herself as the victim. She demanded the house, alimony, a share of James's retirement savings. Her lawyer, a sleek woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, argued that Lisa had given 15 years of her life to the marriage and deserved to be compensated. Then James' lawyer stood up, and Lisa's case fell apart in real time. James had proof, clear, undeniable proof of her affair. Security footage from the hotel she had been visiting regularly, bank statements showing unexplained cash withdrawals, texts recovered from an old cloud backup that painted a damning picture of deception. Then came the financial recklessness. James's legal team had gone through their accounts with a fine-tooth comb. Lisa had been siphoning money out of their joint accounts for months, spending thousands on luxury items, expensive dinners, hotel stays, and even gifts for a man James had never met. It was all there, in black and white, a clear betrayal not just of their marriage, but of their family's financial security. And then, the final nail in the coffin, her false accusations. James had recorded their confrontation the night she had threatened to call the police and lie about him hitting her. The audio played in court, her voice crystal clear, dripping with malice. "If you don't leave, I'll call the cops and tell them you hit me. You know how this works, James. They'll arrest you first and ask questions later. 48 hours in a holding cell, and by then, I'll have changed the locks." Silence filled the courtroom as the judge listened, his expression darkening with every word. Lisa sat frozen, her face drained of color as reality settled over her like a crushing weight. When the gavel finally struck, the ruling was clear. James would keep the house. He would retain full custody of their children. Lisa would walk away with almost nothing. No alimony, no financial support. The only thing she got to keep was the car she had crashed into the police vehicle, now a totaled wreck sitting in an impound lot. She tried to protest, her voice shrill and desperate, but the judge shut her down swiftly, his tone laced with something that sounded a lot like disgust. "You have shown a complete disregard for your responsibilities as a wife, a mother, and a member of this community. Your actions have consequences, Mrs. Dawson, and today you are facing them." Lisa's world crumbled right there in that courtroom, her carefully curated image torn apart piece by piece. She had walked in believing she would destroy James. Instead, she was the one left with nothing. James stood on the porch, sipping his morning coffee as the sun cast golden hues across the Texas horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and distant barbecue smoke from a neighbor's yard. It had been months since the divorce was finalized, and though the chaos had left its scars, he felt lighter than he had in years. There was no more waiting for the other shoe to drop. No more tension thickening the air in his own home. The house, once filled with cold silence and unspoken resentment, now felt like a sanctuary, a place of peace, of healing, of new beginnings. His kids had noticed the change too. Michael, who had been more withdrawn in the months leading up to the divorce, had started opening up again. He no longer carried the weight of his mother's absence like a silent burden. Instead, he spent his afternoons tossing a football around with James in the backyard, cracking jokes, talking about school, about life. Sophia, with her bright, boundless energy, had declared that their house was so much better now. She didn't have to tiptoe around her mother's moods or listen to arguments that never seemed to end. James could see it in their eyes. The relief, the security, the quiet joy of knowing that this was their home again. For the first time in years, James had the freedom to rediscover himself. He started hitting the gym not for revenge, not to prove anything to Lisa, but for himself. He reconnected with old friends, people he had drifted from while trying to hold together a marriage that had been doomed long before he admitted it. He threw himself into work, finding satisfaction in projects that challenged him, that reminded him of his own worth outside of being a husband and a father. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. And then there was Rebecca. They had met under less than ideal circumstances. She had been the lawyer representing him in the divorce, sharp-witted, fiercely intelligent, and relentless in the courtroom. At first, their conversations had been strictly professional, discussing legal strategy, gathering evidence, ensuring that Lisa didn't manipulate the system in her favor. But as the case progressed, their interactions had shifted, softened. Rebecca wasn't just a lawyer. She was a single mother raising a teenage son, balancing work and parenting with the kind of quiet strength that James couldn't help but admire. It had started with small moments, lingering conversations after court sessions, casual coffee meetings that stretched longer than necessary. She had a way of cutting through the noise, of seeing him for who he really was, not just as the man fighting to keep his family intact, but as a person rebuilding his life from the ground up. There were no games with her, no power struggles, no hidden agendas. Just honesty, mutual respect, and an understanding that neither of them had time for anything less than the real thing. One evening, after another long day in court, they had found themselves sitting across from each other in a quiet little diner, exhaustion etched into both their faces. Rebecca had leaned back in her seat, studying him with that keen, assessing gaze of hers before saying, "You know, you're handling this better than most. A lot of men in your position would be out for blood." James had chuckled, shaking his head. "Revenge isn't worth it. Lisa already lost. She just doesn't know it yet." Rebecca had smiled then, something knowing in her eyes. "I like that." That night had been the beginning of something neither of them had planned. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, wasn't some dramatic rebound meant to fill the void left by Lisa. It was slow, steady, built on late-night talks, shared stories of past heartbreaks, and the kind of trust that came from knowing what it meant to be broken and still choosing to move forward. Months passed, and what started as friendship deepened into something undeniable. Rebecca wasn't just someone James enjoyed spending time with. She was someone who made him feel like himself again. There was no walking on eggshells, no second-guessing every word, every action. With her, love wasn't a battlefield. It was easy. It was real. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the kids chase fireflies in the yard, Rebecca reached over, lacing her fingers with his. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked, her voice soft but certain. James exhaled, squeezing her hand gently. "Yeah," he said, watching Michael laugh as Sophia tackled him onto the grass. "And for the first time in a long time, I'm actually looking forward to it." Rebecca smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. James closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the warmth of the moment, the weight of the past finally lifting off his shoulders. For years, he had lived in the shadow of a marriage that had drained him, suffocated him, convinced him that he had to fight for something that was never truly his. But now, in the quiet comfort of a new beginning, he realized something Lisa never had. Love wasn't about control. It wasn't about power or winning. It was about peace. And this was peace. Years passed, and Lisa's life unraveled in ways she had never expected. She had remarried twice, both times believing she had finally secured the life she had always deserved. Both marriages ended in disaster. The first husband, a smooth-talking businessman, left her the moment she started demanding too much, unwilling to deal with her entitled attitude and constant need for control. The second was younger, charming but reckless, draining what little savings she had left before disappearing without a trace. She had gone from living in a comfortable home with a devoted husband to bouncing between cheap apartments, struggling to maintain a lifestyle she could no longer afford. The high-paying finance job she had once boasted about was long gone, her reputation tarnished by office gossip and poor decisions. Now, she hopped from one short-term contract to another, never quite able to land on solid ground. The years had not been kind to her. The confident, calculating woman who once smirked at James in the mirror was gone, replaced by someone bitter, exhausted, constantly looking over her shoulder. She had burned too many bridges, pushed away too many people who had once cared for her. Even her children, now older and fully aware of the choices she had made, kept their distance. Michael tolerated her out of obligation, but their conversations were forced, hollow. Sophia barely spoke to her at all. Lisa had spent years chasing the illusion of something better, something grander than the life she had with James. But in the end, she had been left with nothing. James, on the other hand, thrived. His life wasn't perfect, no life ever was, but it was full, steady, and undeniably happy. His home, once a place of tension and quiet resentment, was now warm and inviting. Laughter filled the air on weekends, the scent of home-cooked meals drifting from the kitchen as Rebecca and Sophia swapped recipes, teasing each other over who made the better sauce. Michael, now in college, still came home often, always eager to sit with his dad on the porch and talk about everything from school to life to the things that truly mattered. James no longer carried resentment for Lisa. There was no bitterness left, no lingering anger. She was simply a chapter in his past, one that had taught him lessons he would never forget. He had learned the hard way that love wasn't about endurance, about how much pain one could withstand before finally breaking. Love wasn't meant to be a battlefield. It was meant to be a choice, freely given and freely received. And now, with Rebecca, he finally understood what that meant. One evening, as he sat on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, he found himself thinking about everything that had led him here. Lisa had once told him that she would take everything from him, that she would leave him with nothing, but she had been wrong. She had thought she could break him. Instead, she had destroyed herself. James had won, but not in the way Lisa had imagined. He hadn't won through revenge, through bitterness, through getting even. He had won by moving on, by rebuilding, by refusing to let someone else's betrayal define him. He had won by choosing happiness, by choosing peace. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's walking away with your dignity intact, letting karma take care of the rest. It's choosing to focus on what's ahead instead of what's behind. It's realizing that the people who betray you don't deserve your energy, your pain, or your anger. James set his coffee down and took a deep breath, closing his eyes as the cool evening breeze rustled through the trees. The past was the past. He had built something better. He had finally found what Lisa never could: peace. Have you ever faced betrayal? How did you handle it? Drop your story in the comments below. Never beg someone to stay. If they want to leave, hold the door open. Karma will handle the rest. Walk away with your dignity intact and let life reward you for it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Every story holds a lesson, every struggle carries a purpose, and every betrayal is just another chapter before redemption. Life has a way of balancing the scales, of delivering justice in ways we least expect. If you've ever felt broken, lost, or betrayed, remember, your story isn't over. You have the power to rise, to rebuild, and to reclaim your happiness. Together, we can create a world where self-worth triumphs over manipulation, where resilience shines brighter than revenge, and where dignity is not just recognized but fiercely protected. Stay strong, stay true, and keep moving forward.